Okay, so thank you so much for having me today. This is exciting because I've also heard a lot about your projects, and so it's nice to be making this connection. And maybe I'll give a little bit of background about where this work comes from, how I got involved with it before I jump into sharing my slides. Um, so I started this work maybe 2013. So what is that? Like 10 years ago almost, with the Post Growth Institute. So I was a co-director of the Post Growth Institute, and we were basically, so it was an international collective of researchers and activists who are, passionate about figuring out post-growth solutions. How can we go beyond the growth-based economy? And at some point, one of the other co-directors, Donnie McClurkin, came to the group, and he had had this sort of aha moment because he had been at a conference in Sydney, Australia, where he was based at the time. And he had been listening to this presentation about a company called Mayuma, which is a civil engineering company in Australia. And so they were building roads and building bridges and doing all of these interesting projects. And they had a revenue of over 20 million Australian dollars per year. So they were doing all of these things. And then they sort of ended their presentation by saying, and we're not for profit. So all of the surplus that we make goes back to benefiting the Aboriginal community that owns this company. And so Donnie just sort of, it clicked with him, and he brought this insight to our group that maybe not-for-profit forms of business are a key leverage point for going beyond the growth-based economy, because they don't constantly have to pursue private profit. And there's like a circularity in them that recycles the profit for social benefit. So we started working on this model. We developed a conceptual model of a post-growth market economy called the not-for-profit world. So it's a market economy made up of not-for-profit businesses. And then I ended up working or further developing this into what I call relationship to profit theory in my PhD, which I finished just last year. So that's sort of the background, how I got involved in this. And now I'll give you more of the substance. Let me share my screen here. Right, so I think I am sharing, and there is my slide. Just now I can't see you guys at all, so just speak up if you can't see my slides or if something goes wrong. Yes, so let's jump in here. So here's the thesis. If you want to look it up, it's available online. Relationship to Profit, a theory of business, markets, and profit for social ecological economics. And I'm going to start with a bold claim, and that is that business, markets, and profit have been poorly understood and underdefined in post-growth literature. Because profit seeking is widely identified as a key problem in the literature, but it's not very well defined how. Like, what are the causal mechanisms between profit seeking and the growth-based economy? Why do actors seek profit in the first place? How can this be resolved? How should business and markets be transformed or replaced for sustainability? And so, in much of the post-growth literature, when I started digging into this, I was really surprised to not see much of a role of business and markets at all in that literature, and especially in terms of how they can be transformed or replaced. And so I in my thesis, I call this a theoretical mess, because the problem is identified, but then it's sort of just skipped over in much of the literature. And so one problem here, so I think I've identified three main problems here. One is there are these assumptions about markets, and I think they're really implicit and largely unexamined assumptions about markets. Most of the literature assumes that markets are capitalist, that they're naturally profit-driven. And you see this throughout the literature in terms of reading about the market or market logic, that this is all usually assumes that this is a profit-driven or capitalist market. But not all markets are capitalist and profit-driven. Problem number 2 is that business is underdefined. So there's often a focus on shareholder-owned firms as the problem, and cooperatives or social enterprises or small local family-owned businesses are the solution. But all of these can be privately owned and operated for profit. And these are not even, covering the whole wide spectrum of diversity that you find in business. And they can all be privately owned and operated for profit. And like I said, there are many other kinds of firms. So a potential alternative is overlooked because this doesn't cover that entire spectrum. And of course, that alternative for me is not-for-profit business. The third and final problem I'll talk about here is the micro-macro divide. The business literature often doesn't mention markets or the aggregate economy. And I've been in, business-focused sessions at degrowth conferences, for instance, and it's just focused on organizations, the organizational form, but very rarely does the conversation ever get into, okay, why is this important for the larger economy? And vice versa. So the macro and economic literature, how can we have a degrowth or post-growth economy, doesn't usually address business, as I mentioned before. But profit-seeking happens at the level of the firm. So if profit-seeking is one of these key drivers that's been identified, then we have to get past this micro-macro divide. And this is where institutional economics can be really helpful, because there's this key insight that property rights in firms have significant impacts on market dynamics. So the assignment of property rights can have system-wide implications. And we'll get into that in a moment. So here I'll give just a little bit more background into this institutional perspective. And I draw on Scott and his book, what's it called? Institutions and Organizations, published in 2014. And so basically there's two main categories of institutions. There's formal institutions, which are enforceable and explicit institutions, so like property rights and contracts and laws, things that are usually written out and can be enforced. And then there's informal institutions, which are more like loose social rules. And I should say institutions here are defined as sets of social rules that are embedded in organizations or social systems. So informal institutions are more like our social norms, belief systems, and the logics. And there's sort of a relationship between the formal institutions and the informal institutions, and that they support each other. So formal institutions sort of reinforce the beliefs that they are embedded in or that they are come from, and vice versa. These informal institutions, like the beliefs or the logics, support certain kinds of formal institutions, certain kinds of laws or business frameworks. And then together, these different kinds of institutions also impact actors' behavior, and actors, have agency and can either reinforce or push back on these different kinds of institutions or change them. So this is sort of the way that I've been looking at the economy. And there's a really important role here for institutional alignment. So if we have, for instance, degrowth or post-growth values and belief systems that say the economy exists to meet human needs, and that should be done within the ecological limits of the planet, then that's an informal institution, right? That's sort of a narrative or a value or a belief. What are the formal institutions that actually align with that? And I'm going to argue that it's not capitalist institutions and it's not for-profit business. So if profit-seeking is a key driver, what causes it? from this institutional perspective, we can say that, what are the formal and informal institutions that encourage profit-seeking behavior? And this is where the for-profit versus not-for-profit distinction becomes very interesting, because for the purposes of today's presentation, I'll just focus on two key differences between for-profit and not-for-profit. And these are legal frameworks, so that's important to keep in mind. For-profit and not-for-profit are legal frameworks, so they're in that formal institution box. And the difference there is really in terms of purpose and financial rights. So in terms of the legal purpose, for-profits have an embedded purpose of financial gain, of producing financial gain for their owners and investors, whereas not-for-profits have the core purpose of social benefit, and they are legally prohibited from delivering profit to private owners. And that's where it's tied to the financial rights. So financial rights are the right for somebody or you to receive the profit and assets of a firm. So, and when I say profit, I'm talking about the financial surplus of a business after it has generated all of its revenue and then covered all of its expenses, including wages and rent and all of that sort of thing. So that surplus is the profit. And in for-profit businesses, the right to receive that profit is privately allocated. So private owners and investors can receive the profit. In not-for-profit forms of business or organizations, I call it collective financial rights. You could also say there are no financial rights. But the main thing is that legally, all of the profit and resources of the company have to go back into their social benefit mission. So it can't be privately distributed. Right. And so now, what is a not-for-profit business? And most of us are not used to thinking or hearing about not-for-profit business. It's a term that I'm really trying to actively promote. Because most people are used to thinking about not-for-profits, as charity dependent and traditionally dependent on grants and philanthropy and donations, not as doing business. And then, on the other hand, businesses are thought of as having to be for-profit. They have shareholders and private owners. But not-for-profit businesses are nonprofits that seek to be financially self-sufficient through the sale of goods and services on the market. So it's sort of an ideal hybrid is what we called it at the Post-Growth Institute. And many types of businesses are not-for-profit. So there's nonprofits and charities that generate most of their revenue through business. Many, but not all, social enterprises are not-for-profit. And, there are for-profit social enterprises sort of act like not-for-profits. But the problem with social enterprise is it's not very clearly legally defined in most places. So Unilever tomorrow could say, oh, we have a social enterprise. And then, there's big questions about whether that's post-growth compatible. Mutual companies. So if you think about mutual insurance companies, for instance, are not-for-profit. Consumer cooperatives and credit unions as well. Because any sort of dividend that you get back from your consumer cooperative, for instance, a grocery store where it's a consumer cooperative, any sort of dividend that you get is not going to make you rich because you spent more money in paying for your groceries all year than the money that you'll get back. So it's more like a bit of a refund on the money you've spent in. Okay, so that's all quite technical, but let me make it a bit more concrete for you. Here's some examples of not-for-profit businesses. So this is BRAC. They are, and I'm giving these examples just to show the diversity of not-for-profit businesses, both geographically, but also in different sectors. So BRAC is based in Bangladesh, and their social benefit mission is making healthcare and education accessible to rural Bangladeshis. And the business part is that they're not dependent on philanthropy and grants and donations to do that. They operate social enterprises. So, for instance, they they operate a dairy, they operate a micro loan service and other banking services. They have some different retail shops where they sell goods that were made by the rural Bangladeshis that are going to benefit from their work. Another example is a real estate company. So again, just trying to show off some of the diversity here, because before I started this work, I never would have thought that a real estate company could be not-for-profit. But there is a not-for-profit real estate company in Australia here. And so they sell and manage properties and houses, but all of the profit that they get from that goes to helping people who are facing homelessness. So again, keeping the money moving to where it's needed most. Here's an energy cooperative in Catalonia. And some of these, I have to say, I haven't checked back in on these for a couple of years because I've been too busy with other things. So you might know this one. I'm not sure how they're doing now, but Somenergia is not for a consumer cooperative, a renewable energy consumer cooperative. And so again, all of the profit that they make goes back into making renewable energy more accessible and affordable for that community. There's also a not-for-profit cybersecurity company that's doing really cool things in the Netherlands. We found not-for-profit bakeries. We've literally found not-for-profit businesses in every sector of the economy, and also all over the world. I can't say that we found them in every country because we haven't had the resources to do that kind of research, but we found them all over. And every time I travel, I bump into new not-for-profit businesses that I didn't know existed. And we're seeing the emergence of not-for-profit business along a few different lines. So first, traditional nonprofits are increasingly going into business, and there's good data on that from the Johns Hopkins University Center for Civil Society, I think. And there's different explanations for that. One is that they increasingly need to go into business because donations have decreased and support from public institutions has decreased. There's also a new generation of entrepreneurs that are starting up their businesses as not-for-profits because they want to use business as a means for doing social good. And like I said, we found these all over the world in every sector. And so it's an interesting business model, but again, like I said before, my entry point to this was never being interested in business. My entry point was how can we have a post-growth economy? And so really the key insight here goes back to that institutional perspective that dominant business structures drive system-wide dynamics. And to sort of unpack and untangle this, in my work, I developed these ideal types of economies using systems thinking. And so this first ideal type is looking at a for-profit economy. So imagine a market economy in which all of the businesses, all of the companies are for-profit. So they're really just seeking private financial gain for private owners. And so I'm going to take you through this analysis in using systems thinking diagrams called causal loop diagrams. And they basically just help us keep track of the multiple different variables and relationships in a complex system in order to identify key dynamics that drive that system's behavior over time. And if you haven't seen one of these diagrams before, they're pretty easy to understand. So all of these arrows just represent causal relationships. And I go with more like tends to cause from a critical realist perspective, that it's not deterministic. But so the desire for financial gain tends to cause investment. And the plus signs mean that the variables go in the same direction. So more desire for financial gain will lead to more investment. Likewise, less desire for financial gain leads to less investment. And then this R here just means that there's a reinforcing feedback loop. And that means that this system will continue to grow and grow faster all the time, or decrease faster all the time, depending on which way it's headed. Yes, so this is sort of from any basic mainstream economics textbook, right? That the desire for financial gain drives investment, which drives production, which allows for sales and results in more profit. And some of that profit gets reinvested back into this production cycle. But at some point, some of the profit will be distributed to owners in service of this desire for financial gain, the financial gain purpose. And, we're looking at this from a critical post-growth perspective. So we're thinking about what's missing from this picture. And of course, this is nothing new to any of you, but of course, the environment is missing. All of that production and sales has environmental consequences. And another important thing that's been highlighted in post-growth literature is the role of advertising in promoting sales, that we're not all just naturally endless consumers who can never be satisfied, but rather businesses have to use advertising to push us to buy more stuff. And it's a very effective profit-seeking strategy. And that's another term that I use a lot in this work, is thinking of these things as profit-seeking strategies. They're not just anomalies or coincidences that we have so much advertising. It's a profit-seeking strategy, and it's quite effective. Another very effective profit-seeking strategy is planned obsolescence. So when companies design products and services to become obsolete before they really would need to be. And most of you are familiar with that, I'm guessing. Maybe all of you are, but just some examples, like your mobile phone, is often designed to become obsolete before it needs to be. So the software goes bad, and then you have to get a new phone. And so I call this is the first key feedback loop in the system that I call the feedback loop of consumerism. It's also it's sort of the engine of economic growth. Yes, so what else is going on in the system? Well, over time, and that's what these lines here mean, there's a bit of a delay in this relationship compared to what's going on elsewhere in the system. But over time, owners will accumulate the money that they're receiving as dividends, or the profit of these businesses. And as they accumulate money, they have an increased ability to invest in more shares or more ownership of companies, which of course leads them to accumulate even more. And there's also some research showing that the more they accumulate, the more financial gain they desire. So maybe you're familiar with these surveys of multimillionaires who sort of feel like they need to have more and more all the time. They're always looking up at the strata above them, rather than realizing how rich they really are. Then at the same time, so we've got the owners accumulating wealth over here, the wealth accumulation feedback loop. But at the same time, there's an inherent incentive for for-profit companies and their managers to keep wages as low as possible, because wages are a key cost of doing business, right? And so again, wage suppression is a profit-seeking strategy. And here's where these minus signs come into our diagram, that higher wages lead to less profit, lower wages, more profit. And so these dual dynamics of wealth accumulation and wage suppression are driving the inequality that we see. And then there's some research also showing that more inequality also drives more of a desire for financial gain, because nobody wants to be at the bottom of a very steep ladder. So you always want to get higher up on that ladder. And so that was another key dynamic, is the inequality. And then, a lot of the time in sustainability and even in post-growth literature, the solution to this is formulated as, okay, we need more regulations, we need more taxes to redistribute the wealth, or we need a basic income to sort of redistribute the wealth. But we can't forget another really important dynamic in this system, which is an inherent feature of the for-profit economy, I argue, which is that the desire for financial gain also means there's an inherent incentive to influence policy in the direction that is profitable for businesses and their owners, right? And Oxfam calls this political capture. And so I go with that, and political capture is just sort of an umbrella term for all of the efforts to lobby against taxes, lobby against regulations that would protect the environment and workers, but would also be costly for companies, and lobbying for subsidies, for instance. And so to the extent that this political capture is effective, and it is becoming increasingly effective, then redistributional taxes become less effective. Same with environmental and labor regulations. And so this political capture dynamic really just exacerbates inequality and environmental problems. And so those are three key dynamics here: consumerism, inequality, and political capture. The last dynamic that I'll cover, and this I'm going to just turn my laptop a little bit, because I bet you're getting a bunch of sun there. We have sun in Stockholm, which is rare. So this is the last key dynamic, which is that of market concentration. And this diagram looks maybe a bit like intimidating after the stepping up the last one step by step, but it's not that detailed. So the main idea is that we have the dynamics of large firms up here and the dynamics of smaller firms at the bottom. And because investment in the for-profit economy is made for, to get as high of a return as you can, and so it's guided by the perceived profitability of firms, then large firms are mostly perceived as more profitable than smaller firms. So they're getting more investment, which allows them to invest more in ads and planned obsolescence and all the rest of it, increasing their sales, increasing their income, which allows them to then merge with and acquire other companies, allowing them to capture a larger and larger share of the market. And as they do that, so they're basically just pushing smaller firms out. And this is where we see market concentration in the global economy and basically every sector of the economy. And again, I say that it's not a fluke, it's an inherent dynamic of the for-profit economy. Okay, so the system dynamics of the for-profit economy then are consumerism and economic growth, and the related environmental degradation that comes with that, inequality, political capture, and market concentration. So a lot of the literature now is then talking about the triple bottom line, balancing people, planet, and profit. And surprisingly, you even see some of this in post-growth literature, or at least it was surprising to me. So it's important to let's consider that. And also our current economy isn't purely for profit, right? So what about if we add in more social benefit? What about an economy that's made up of businesses that are seeking both private financial gain and social benefit? And often it's talked about as being transformative, but here we can see that it doesn't transform these underlying structures and dynamics, these reinforcing feedback loops that drive social and environmental problems. Rather, it's an add-on. So we've added on the desire for social benefit. We've added on investing money and profit into socially beneficial activities. So could be helping to alleviate poverty, feeding children who don't have enough to eat, protecting a forest, planting trees, whatever it is, so that can reduce inequality and environmental damage. So to the extent that investment is channeled into these socially beneficial activities, we do see some balancing effects. And that's what these Bs up here mean, is that there are balancing feedbacks that sort of slow down these reinforcing dynamics of the destructive dynamics of the economy. But What's not often discussed is that there's a clear trade-off here between the profit going to either owners or to socially beneficial activities. And so, the more that is profit is distributed to owners, the less profit there is to put into these kinds of activities, and vice versa. So there's some tough decisions that have to be made there that aren't often talked about in this triple bottom line or people, planet, profit literature. But I do see, maybe it's worth noting really quick, that I do see this as a potential, this shows the potential for transformation, because if we can start moving away from channeling profit into private owners' hands and start putting it into socially beneficial activities, we can start to transform the economy in this way. So then let's get into the model that I helped develop, which is the not-for-profit world. Here I just present it as a not-for-profit ideal type of economy. So a market in which all of the businesses are not-for-profit, so they have no private financial rights, no private distribution of profit, and they are set up to only seek social benefit. And here is a truly transformed economy compared to the for-profit. We still have, the potential for too much production and consumption. So that's something to definitely be aware of. But the desire for social benefit is now guiding investment and business activities and economic activity in general, rather than the desire for financial gain. And so investment and profit, right away you notice there's no private owners accumulating the profit, because that's not legal in this kind of system. So investment and profit instead go to socially beneficial activities and environmentally beneficial activities, and can then reduce environmental damage and inequality. And so there's a lot more alignment also between the desire for social benefit and the sort of redistributional taxes and labor regulations that we need to address inequality. Also, things like the basic income can align much better with this desire for social benefit than with the desire for financial gain. Also, the environmental regulations to protect the environment align much better, again, this institutional alignment, with the desire for social benefit than the desire for financial gain. And really importantly here, there's a much more balanced system, right? Because you can have those taxes and labor regulations that balance out inequality. You can have strong environmental regulations that keep the nature intact. And as problems are solved, through these investments and through, even just decreasing activity, then there's a feedback that also signals to us, okay, so this problem is solved. For instance, the problem of childhood nutrition. Okay, the community's children are all well fed now. So we don't have to keep trying to feed them more. We don't have to keep investing more and more in that. It's enough. So that's really the key thing that I want to point out here, is this system allows for a sense of enough rather than more, because you can have needs met, whereas the desire for financial gain requires more and more, right? It's even expressed in terms of growth, financial gain. So the dynamics of a not-for-profit type of economy is that it would have more equality. Investment responds to social and environmental conditions. So if there's a need, then investment of, initial capital investment, but also profit and public money goes to solving that problem or fulfilling that need. There's a potential for less consumerism. It's not guaranteed, but at least the system would allow for less consumerism in a way that the for-profit economy does not allow for. And of course, we all know that less consumerism can allow for more well-being and less ecological destruction. And then lastly, sustainability or post-growth interventions can be more effective than in the for-profit economy. So for instance, minimalist lifestyles that we talk a lot about in post-growth scholarship and activism align much better with this type of system and are allowed for much better in this type of system. Whereas, I mean, so for instance, you can imagine in a system and in an economy driven by social benefit, governments could actually have effective regulations on advertising, which allow people to feel less pressure to consume. It could also better regulate planned obsolescence, again, less pressure to consume. It can allow for more sharing because there's not a constant drive to sell more and more. So companies can, you know, sort of sit more easily alongside sharing and gift economies. Okay, so cognizant of the time. Okay, no, we have time. I've got a few more slides. I'm gonna go give you an overview of relationship to profit theory, so how all of these pieces come together, and then just wrap up with some ideas of how I'm taking this forward. So relationship to profit. So we have the for-profit type of business with its legal elements of, you know, financial gain purpose and private financial rights. Profit can be distributed to private owners. And that coincides with these informal institutions. So the norms and logics and beliefs that support those legal elements are that money should be seen as an end. Money is a good measure of success, an exchange-based notion of value. Investment should be made for financial returns. That's the rational thing to do, because the profit motive drives wealth creation, innovation, and efficiency. So basically the capitalist mythology, right? And then those formal and informal institutions shape the strategies that companies use to generate profit, so those profit-seeking strategies. And then in a market of these companies using those profit-seeking strategies, we get these larger dynamics of consumerism, economic growth, environmental degradation, and all of the things I just talked about. Then on the other side, we have not-for-profit. And so this distinction between for-profit and not-for-profit, I call relationship to profit. I should have maybe said that earlier, sorry. Because if in the literature, you often just see like organizational form or organizational type is how this distinction is called. And I thought, well, this is too important to have such a vague term. So I'm gonna call it relationship to profit. Okay, so then we have not-for-profit types of business that have a social benefit purpose, collective financial rights, and the profit has to be reinvested for social benefit. And so the norms, logic, and beliefs that support that way of organizing business is that money is a means to meet social and environmental ends. There's a use-based notion of value. So you do things in order to derive social usefulness rather than just to make more money. Social and ecological well-being are the measure of success rather than financial gain. And the investment should be made for meeting social needs, not for just making more money. And so these institutional forms shape the strategies that companies use to then meet social needs, not just to generate profit. And we would see different dynamics on the market level. So surplus going to social and ecological benefit, allowing for a non-growing and shrinking economy, and allowing for effective sustainability interventions. And again, just to point out the institutional alignment here, because one of the things that I noticed in the literature is that post-growth and degrowth literature seems to be very clearly rooted in this set of norms, logic, and beliefs, but still allows for for-profit and capitalist organizational forms. And so there's not good institutional alignment there. There's some confusion, there's some incoherence there. Okay, so getting to the wrap up here, the way that I see the not-for-profit economy is that it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all of our problems. It's not going to automatically be post-growth, but I see it as necessary, but not sufficient. I see it as necessary because I don't see how a for-profit economy can be sustainable and post-growth. But we also need a not-for-profit economy to be relocalized. We need to have a culture of sufficiency, has to be grounded in social justice. We need it to be also circular, and to also regenerate ecosystems, because we've reached such a sad level of ecosystem degradation now. But excitingly, the not-for-profit market economy offers a way beyond capitalism and the state-planned communism sort of dichotomy that public discourse has been trapped in for such a long time, mostly due to the Cold War, I would argue, because it's a market economy, but it's not capitalist. So it kind of opens up the political economy horizons of how, of possibility. How can we organize a post-growth economy? And this brings me to sort of the next step of where I'm taking this in a postdoc that I'm starting in May with Lund University. So I'm actually also interested to make the connections between you guys and our project that we're starting on post-growth welfare systems down there. I say down, for most of you it's up, it's in the north, but it's in southern Sweden. So here's one way of that I've been thinking about, okay, how can we compare this not-for-profit market economy with other types of economies, especially in this post-growth framing? And so you usually have, this horizontal spectrum of from centralized planned economy to a decentralized market. But because markets, like I said before, are always assumed to be for-profit, this alone does not allow for the kinds of possibilities that we need to be able to talk about. So I added in this vertical spectrum of financial rights and purpose. So we have private financial rights for financial gain, and collective financial rights for social benefit. And so when we put these things together, we see a sort of new political economy compass or map. So we've got like free market capitalism over here, welfare state capitalism, some really dangerous things over here where it's centralized authorities, but also with private financial rights for private gain. But then up here, I would say this is the sort of area where post-growth possibilities become really interesting and exciting. So I would say the not-for-profit market economy that I just talked about would be a form of market socialism, but then there's also ideas in post-growth and degrowth about more like anarcho-socialism, and then there are still some people, talking about state-planned communism. So what I'm saying here is like, let's then open up this map so that we can have more productive discussions and debates about the different kinds of post-growth compatible economies and how they, might even be quite compatible with each other or not. For instance, some post-growth people are talking about welfare state capitalism being post-growth. And I would argue that the inherent tendencies of a for-profit economy, whether it's more welfare state or not, but those inherent tendencies to grow and homogenize the rest of the economy would mean that it's not very easy to sit alongside these other kinds of economies. Anyways, so, the usefulness of the theory. I'm going to go through this quick because I don't know how interesting this is for you. Explains the root causes of global sustainability crises, explains why concerted efforts have not been more effective, outlines a concrete post-growth alternative beyond the debate of capitalism and the state-planned economy, and it can guide. So I'm trying to encourage people to use relationship to profit theory to guide their research, to guide their research questions and analyses, because this is an overlooked possibility. And I think by doing research with this theory, we can raise awareness about it and make it not so overlooked, but actually bring it up as a concrete possibility for discussion and debate. So final slide here, questions about any post-growth solution. So given my analysis, I would say that any post-growth solution you're looking at, you should ask these questions. How does it deal with the dynamics of a for-profit economy? Could it actually work in a for-profit economy? or might it require a not-for-profit transition in tandem? And so that's it. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing my slides. I think I will. There we go. Oh, I just realized it had turned off the camera while I was talking. So you guys didn't get the sun. That's good.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think that was a fantastic presentation. Every time I learn something new when you present. So I think that's fantastic. I don't want to take any space up regarding questions. We had many discussions already. If there's not enough questions, which I don't think that will be the case, I will ask something. But let me maybe open the floor to everyone. So if you can just use the raise hand, Mario's already doing it. So I'll give Mario the floor to ask some questions or comment.
Oh, I think you're muted, Mario.
Again, thank you very much for being here. I have one request and two quick questions. The first one is we are doing a mapping exercise with the post-growth organization. So it would be nice if you can share some of your cases. I don't know if you have done like a systematic search for cases of non-for-profit business. It would be good if you can share it with us, because what we're doing is looking for potential cases of post-growth organization that are also innovative and creative. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you don't have this level of analysis. Just share with us, and then we can apply a filter. For example, one of the cases that we already identified is Somenergia, which is actually a really interesting case. Then two questions. Very quick question. The first one is what about innovation and technology? No, because the mantra of innovation studies is we cannot stop the profit mechanism. So profits is essential because it actually leads to more creative business. Startups and all the narrative of Silicon Valley. If people don't have the profits, so motivation, they will not be creative. How this connects with your idea of non-for-profit business? Because this is very much the question in Prospera. How can we create a system of populated by organizations that are post-growth organizations, but at the same time creative? So how innovation and innovation incentive look like in a world that is not obsessed with economic growth and pursuit of profits? And then the second question is more related to our, that in our group we have different souls. One of our souls is Marxist. So when you are talking about financial rights, for me it rings a bell, because from Marxist perspective we talk about property and ownership and mean of production and stuff like that. So, and because this is a debate that we have in the group, is it possible to have a post-growth transition if we don't question ownership of capital, of means production, but also ownership of the units of production? No, we are, for example, we do look for occupied factories or experience in which the workers try or attempt to run production in a self-managed way. So how this connect? Because I know that Scott's institution can resemble, or there are ways in which you can connect Scott's theory with the more consolidated tradition, like Marxists. They talk about structure and superstructure, and there are also some like overlapping there. But it's also for some people, Scott's way of seeing institution is also a apolitical way of seeing institution. This is one of the criticisms that we can do now to institutional theory from Marxism. Okay, so how ownership, what is the role of ownership in your models or your reflection? I understand that this is like a work in progress, no? That you don't have like definitive like models. Okay, I finished my question.
Okay, good. Yeah, so for your request, so when I first started doing this work with the Post-Growth Institute, one of the first things we did was like a scoping exercise to see if we could find not-for-profit businesses in different parts of the world and in different sectors of the economy. So we've got a database of like, and I say I'm not working with them anymore. They still haven't published our book, so I'm a bit frustrated with them. And they've been sitting on that book for like 6 years now. But anyways, we have a database of like 300 case studies. So case studies, we haven't looked at them, but we have a database of 300 not-for-profit businesses. And I can share that with you. I've been wanting to get that up on a website for a very long time. Had some friends promise me they'd help me with it. Hasn't happened. Anyways, I can share that with you. And then with the innovation and tech, so there is a guy who's been working with this, looking at not-for-profit businesses and innovation. So I could also introduce you to him. He's down in Australia. And I know he's been looking at a few cases. I think he's done more in-depth case studies with just a couple of businesses, but he might have some interesting findings for you. Then when it comes to this larger dynamic, or like the larger question about innovation and tech and the profit motive and all of that, I think, this is where we need to just break down this myth and debunk the myth that the profit motive is necessary for innovation. Because I think, first of all, there's a lot of examples of innovation not coming from the profit motive. So computers were first innovated by publicly funded universities. And if you think back about the whole breadth of human history, most innovation has come from the need to solve problems and from just innate human creativity. We all have creativity. And so there's this innate desire to innovate. And I think we can go back to that. We don't have to. The other thing is that these not-for-profit businesses are highly innovative. They innovate. There's a lot of social innovation in the way that they make decisions. There's a lot of innovation in the way that they deal with the for-profit market dynamics that they're caught in. So there is a lot of not-for-profit innovation already happening out there. Yeah, and then I would also point out to the negative kinds of innovation that happen in the for-profit economy because of the profit motive, because innovation is often used as a purely positive term. And I know you guys don't think of it that way probably, but it's like, oh, innovation is always a good thing. But is it good for for-profit pharmaceutical companies to be using their resources to develop medicine for male pattern baldness while thousands or millions of children are dying from malaria every year in low-income countries? These sorts of things. So the types of innovations and for whom become really important questions. What kind of innovation and for whom? And I think there we can say for-profit innovation often is very misguided in the kinds of things it innovates and for whom, whereas not-for-profit innovation is really geared at helping people who are facing difficulty. It's about meeting social needs. Yes. So those are just some thoughts about that. The ownership question. One thing that it was sort of an aha moment for me in reading through institutional economic literature is that some of these authors have distinguished between, and I agree with them, they sort of argue that we need to distinguish between two different aspects of ownership. Ownership, I don't even like to use that word anymore because it encompasses two very different things. One is control and the other is financial rights. So we talk about control rights and financial rights. And control rights, every organization needs to be controlled somehow. So control rights, you could say these not-for-profit businesses have owners in terms of there are people controlling them. but they don't have owners in terms of the financial rights. There are no private owners, financial owners of these companies. So that's one really important insight that I've had, is I don't even talk about ownership anymore. I don't talk about owners. I talk about control and financial rights. Then when it comes to institutional theory being, oh, well, maybe I'll relate that back to your question about Marxism, so financial rights then, as related to Marx and the ownership of the means of production, I think, then we can talk about, should the means of production be democratically controlled, or controlled by different businesses that are controlled by their workers, or can there still be CEOs? There are interesting questions about control there, but I think from a Marxist perspective, you would want no private financial rights. From a purely, so that's always seemed like a bit of a contradiction to me, because worker co-ops have private financial rights, which still can have this profit-driven mechanism in them. So that's interesting. Institutional theory being apolitical, and Scott, I think that it is kind of apolitical, but I think that then it almost invites you to bring the politics into it. So, the way that I have with the for-profit, not-for-profit institutions makes it political right away, is that the capitalist economy is a for-profit economy, and that has these institutional elements of private financial gain as a purpose and private financial rights. So I think that it's not apolitical in the sense that you can't bring politics into it. It invites you to bring the politics by looking at the different kinds of institutional arrangements that economy is made of, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. I've got Alex and Andrea, but Andrea lowered his hand and then raised it again. Andrea, do you want to go first?
Okay, sorry, I raised my hand again because Mario had asked a question that seemed related to what I wanted to ask. Then I thought to ask my question again. Oh, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask something more about what seems to be the key question in this transition. Who decides what to produce, how to produce, how much to produce, and what role have markets in this? That is an allocation problem. I think, what you have discussed today can be traced back to the well-known socialist calculation problem, the very famous battle between Hayek Mises and Oscar Lange. And, I sympathize very much with Oscar Lange and with his proposal of so-called market socialism, which is a framework where you have some elements of central planning, but you allow private firms, workers' cooperatives to operate, but then you leave part of the allocation to the market. And of course, I mean, you can characterize these firms as not-for-profit organizations. Is this the kind of model you are thinking of? Is it somehow related to other historical experiences of market socialism? I think we can think about, the Yugoslavia of the 60s, the 70s. These are all historical experiences which have been classified as market socialism. That's why, I would say that term probably needs to be used with care, because it has already got a historical characterization. And it is something that I really like, and I think can be very useful in a post-growth scenario. But just wanted to be sure you were aware of this debate, of these models, and these are in a way related to what you are proposing. Thank you.
No, thank you, Andrea. No, actually, to be honest, so that's where that final political economy compass that I brought up with the market socialism. So this is sort of how I'm taking my work forward. And to be honest, I haven't gone into depth with that. So these are really helpful starting points for me to look into more. So market socialism, I've just read very superficial things about, but it seemed to align with the not-for-profit world model in the way that you were mentioning that in our model, we talk about there's a market economy that is made up of not-for-profit businesses, and then the role of the state. So there's like a partner state, and the market and the state work together in a partnership to make sure that everybody's needs are equitably met within the ecological boundaries. So there's this constant dialogue and negotiation between market and state. But one of the ideas is that the market, because it is not for profit and all of these companies are oriented towards social benefit, the market itself becomes a bit of a social safety net. So it takes on a totally different dynamic between the market and the state compared to the capitalist economy, right? Where the market is undermining social needs and equality, and the state has to try to compensate for that or correct it somehow. So that's the way that we've characterized it. And to be honest, I don't know how well it fits with these historical examples that you mentioned or the debate that you mentioned. But if you can, I would love if you can send a couple of articles my way or literature that I can look into, because that's sort of the next step that I want to take.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll do that.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So, Alex, thank you for waiting patiently.
Javier, who's going to speak first?
Yeah, sorry, it wasn't Alex's question. It's my question. I'm Javier. I just couldn't raise my hand with my laptop. So thank you very much, Jen. I love your presentation. I love your work, and I was aware of it before this talk. But today you sort of like went forward in some of the things that I really wanted to hear. And just to give you a bit of background, like I did my PhD about the question of markets in degrowth. Like I did my PhD in marketing, so I grapple exactly with the same question. And when you started with your bold claim, the market is the greatly misunderstood institution in degrowth, I totally agree with that. And sometimes when you say it, people would disagree, but I know where you're coming from, and I totally agree with that point. So my work took a different turn later. I did more like an ethnographic work. I didn't try to build a model. So I really appreciate your idea of model building. I tried to get more into the nitty-gritty of how markets work, not for-profit markets. And one of the things that I was missing from your diagram, which became very important, not in my PhD, but later in another paper I published about mutualism, is the role of credit. And the role of credit and debt in driving growth, not necessarily profit. And when I started to grapple with this question, I found that this question has already been grappled with by some of the great anarchist thinkers like Jean-Pierre Proudhon, and he talked about the idea of mutual credit systems. So my question to you is to what, and in many ways overlaps with some of the stuff that Andrea said, have you thought about mutualism as a blueprint from some of the ideas that you are working on? So that's my first question. My second question is got to do with the idea of markets. So one thing is to have non-for-profit businesses, but the other thing is the market itself as an institution. And to me, a key question here, again, I think Andrea asked this question in a different way, is how the markets are governed. So it's the question of governance. And again, I go back to the idea of mutualism, because there is no dichotomy between central planning or free markets here. What I think the idea of mutualism is that this central planning can be thought of as a form of federation, where workers themselves set the rules of the game at different scales. So we start with the business, and then like you can have like a broader sort of, but the idea is like, it's not a sort of centralized in the more like central planning sense of the word. It's centralized to the extent that it is workers themselves who set the rules of the game. So my work with markets is about how actors can govern the market as a common. So not the common as a resource, but the market itself as a common institution, where, for example, credit becomes a commons. So I don't know, like that is not really a question, maybe more like something to think about. Maybe my question more is about the importance of mutualism, I think, for framing some of the ideas that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, thank you, Javier. I think, so, yeah, you brought a lot. So the mutual credit systems, and going back to like the issue of credit and debt, I think mutual credit systems are wonderful and very compatible with this not-for-profit market economy. So I think that could be like, as I said before, I think that it's necessary but not sufficient. So, bring in mutual credit systems. I think there's all kinds of different pieces that come together to make this more like an ideal post-growth economy. And mutualism is a good way of framing it. One thing when we talk about like decentralized planning, like you mentioned, I think that's a really interesting way of framing it. And I like that way of framing it, which makes me even question this horizontal line that I have in my compass, which went from a centralized planning to decentralized market. What is the role for planning in a decentralized market? And this decentralized planning is a really interesting idea that goes with mutualism. One thing that I would add to that idea is that it shouldn't just be workers. I think that, bringing this more holistic, systemic sustainability perspective means that there's a lot of important social stakeholders here, and it's not just about workers. And that's one thing that I've always wanted to, and I think a lot of Marxists, especially the more ecological Marxist scholars, bring in this idea of bringing more social stakeholders into the dialogue than just a focus on workers. So that's just one thing that comes to mind for me. How markets are governed and governing the market as a commons. I love that idea as well. I think we should talk more about that. I think that's cool. And then again, governing it as a commons, the role of a centralized state, but also this role of decentralized planning. I think that, just because it's a not-for-profit market economy, it shouldn't be a free not-for-profit market economy. And it comes back, like you said, to Andrea's question about what to produce and how much. And I think that needs to happen in these dialogues with municipalities, but also the national state government, and then also all of these other social stakeholders that are important. Yeah.
Nobody else has a question, then I think I've got a question that might lead on to Javier's point, which is, for me, in the last big diagram that you had, where we're like, okay, this is the not-for-profit economy, and this is how it could work. For me, the fact that there was still this reinforcing feedback loop of profit, that even in a not-for-profit economy, in this conceptualization, there's still the concept of profit. And for me, this is, can we think beyond that? Maybe this is the next step, and we take out profit altogether, where we say like, okay, production, even though like it's not profit driven, there's still the idea of production of sales and money, so that we have investment again, even though maybe we change the property rights of profit or the property rights of that production. And maybe this then goes hand in hand with what Javier was saying. There's this idea, particularly in the peer-to-peer literature, of a commons economy. And maybe this is the step after the not-for-profit economy, where we can also take out the profit altogether. And maybe there's overlap with commons management and the idea of scaling wide commons, that commons manage each other together in a bigger, wider commons. maybe this could be something. What would you think about something like that?
Yeah, no, I love the commons economy idea, and like David Baudillard's work on the commons and these sorts of things. So I think that, yeah, exactly. Maybe that's one of the other types of economies that sits on that political economy compass, and one of the ways that I want to take that literature or that work, like I mentioned, is to sort of map out these different post-growth compatible economies. So like the commons economy could be one of those, and sort of see how these things can sit together. Because I think, even with that, we would probably still want markets and business in some way, and maybe, or at least some communities would, but then, that could sit alongside these more like gift-based economies and commons economies. And so it would be interesting to think about how these different types of economies can fit together and work together, in this mutualistic, decentralized planning way that was mentioned before. I think that could be really good. So that's what I want to do next. And then I don't know. I thought, again, that Javier mentioned the role of credit in the debt, and I thought it might be important just to point out one more thing, because it came back to me, is that, in this not-for-profit world model, all banks and all financial institutions are not-for-profit as well. So then debt and credit, it's just important to point out, are done through not-for-profit banks and financial institutions themselves that are tied to a social benefit purpose and have to use all their profit for socially useful activities. So it does tie into sort of like mutual credit systems in a way. Just wanted to point that out.
Perfect, thank you. Now I hope Alex has his own question this time.
Do you listen to this?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's fine. We are having some trouble with the connection. So yes, thank you so much, Jennifer. I will join all the comments that everyone has said about how useful is your work, especially for me, who's starting his PhD on post-growth organizations. I have three questions. The first one is, how do you see the cohabitation between for-profit organizations and non-for-profit organizations? The second one...
Is it me or is it him? No, okay, Ben, I can still see you moving.
Maybe you want to answer the first question, and then we get Alex onto Mario's. Shall we get Alex onto Mario's PC?
Está en el mío, pero no puede tampoco.
Voy a la de Mario, ¿no? Igual, mejor.
Maybe answer the first question, Jennifer, and then we move Alex to one of the other PCs.
Sure. I was actually going to ask him for clarification, because I think I missed the first part of it. He said something about what the relationship is between for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. Did you catch it more specifically?
No, but Alex, do you want to try at Javi's laptop or at Mario's?
Oh, God, I hate technical problems.
Is the internet dead in Casa das Campas? Javier, can you unmute yourself?
I was just saying that Alex was talking about the cohabitation, like not between these two types of economy.
Okay, thanks. That's the word that I missed. Okay, the cohabitation between for-profit and not-for-profit organizations, and maybe also for-profit and not-for-profit types of economies. I think it's a very uneasy cohabitation, a very uneasy relationship, because for-profit companies and economies are driven to grow, right? And they're driven to constantly find new ways to convert things into goods and services, to convert more and more of nature and social relationships into goods and services. And so this tendency to grow and take over and homogenize everything around it means that it's I think, quite difficult for a not-for-profit economy to coexist with a for-profit economy. And it's also means that not-for-profit businesses, and also any business that's trying to be sustainable, is swimming upstream against the current in the for-profit economy, which is why I think in terms of transition, it's very important for this to have a social movement, basically, that is guided by this vision of, no, we want a not-for-profit economy, and we're going to push for all economic institutions to move in that direction. We're not just going to be satisfied with some parts of some sectors being not-for-profit, because the for-profit economy will inevitably keep encroaching onto those not-for-profit niches. So what we need is to push for those niches to become the mainstream.
Okay. I think we're looking whether Alex can rejoin for his other two questions.
Yeah, at least it's recorded so they can see the answer to the question.
Well, he's in the room where Javier still has his laptop, but I think they're still trying to see if they can, somehow they can't unmute themselves, which is really weird.
Yeah.
Have we got any other questions otherwise from other people while we try to figure this out?
Is there anything in the chat? I haven't kept up with the chat at all. Oh, that's where you got the cohabitation. Good.
Yeah.
If I might say something or ask something, I'm Javier, and I was thinking about this cohabitation, no? When you were talking, because if you begin, I mean, when you talk about the desire for profit and the desire for social, how was it, social benefit? Mm-hmm. I was thinking like, and also the concept of innovation, like for-profit economies rely on competition to improve the performance of social actors, or the performance of the economy, innovation, and all of that, no? Progress and all of that. And when we talk about the desire for social benefit, we're talking about mutualism, and also the idea that came to my mind is the concept of mutual aid, that is very old, like from Kropotkin, like it's like very old thing, like the difference between mutual aid and competition. How, like, the original thesis of Kropotkin was that mutual aid was really what made species survive and evolve and all of that. But here, when we are talking about the cohabitation between these two types of economy, it's like they have to compete somehow. Like if there are non-for-profit businesses, they have to compete in order to gain terrain to the for-profit economy. It's like, I don't know if that makes sense. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, a couple of thoughts. I think we've found evidence that actually not-for-profits have more of a mutual aid tendency. So there are, for instance, we found a not-for-profit software developer in Australia that offered discounts to other not-for-profits. And so there is this sort of, but then charged, for-profits at a normal rate. So there is this sort of, I think, tendency that they acknowledge that this is more difficult for us not-for-profits to survive in this market, so we can help each other out. And I think that goes back to, again, we all are in this to help meet social needs. So let's help each other meet those social needs. Whereas when you are driven by financial gain, private financial gain, it's like, it's you or me, so I have to beat you out of this because we both want gain, and I have to get you out of here so I can get as much as I want. So I think that core purpose really leads to different dynamics in terms of competition and cooperation and mutual aid. And there's more of a tendency there for not-for-profits to cooperate. But there still can be competition. And I think it's worth also acknowledging that in the for-profit economy, with these more traditional nonprofit organizations that are dependent on charity and philanthropy, they can get really competitive and ruthless with each other because they're competing for donations and grants. And it feels like there's never enough money for them to do the good things that they need to do. But part of that is just because the for-profit economy is making all of these messes, driving inequality, driving environmental problems, and the non-profits are expected to clean it all up. And so they're like fighting over the scraps in order to try to clean up the problems of the for-profit economy. So sometimes people bring that problem up, or that question for me is like, oh, but nonprofits are so dysfunctional right now. And I point out that that's largely because of the for-profit economy dynamics. Yeah, so those are some thoughts.
Thank you.
So this competition sounds very similar to academia in a way. Academia and a for-profit economy, no?
Yes.
So, I don't know. Maybe Alex can send you his questions via email. I don't know. It seems to be a bit crazy what's going on with the internet or with this Teams meeting.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Or is Alex trying again? I don't know.
But I mean, yeah, any questions can also, definitely feel free to send me an email. And also, I hope that we keep this dialogue going between your guys' interesting Prospera project and Tim Parik and I will be working with Max Koch and others in this post-growth project in Lund. So I think there's a lot of interesting synergies that we could have there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Mario is not officially in the meeting anymore. I don't know where his connection went. But I think I speak for the group if we would love it if you came round to our little project in Pontevedra and spend some time with us. That would be fantastic. Come join us and we can work together. I mean, we're already, but
no, I would love to. I look forward to coming down and interacting more and learning from you guys. I mean, I've already gotten so many leads just from your guys' comments and questions today, so it's great.
Perfect. So yeah,
Alex, I was saying, Alex just called me to try to make the questions through the phone. Like, I don't know. I mean, the time is over, but maybe you have a few. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna try.
This is innovation.
Alex.
Hi. Wow. Okay, so that's for real innovation. Okay, so I had another two questions. So the question 2 is about how do we decide what to do with value in an organization? And my question is, what do you think are the limits of managing value surplus in non-for-profit organizations? No? Because at some point, like if an organization works pretty well, it would overperform maybe. So then we have the question of self-managing the value or collectivizing the value, no? So that's the first question, and then the third question is about how do we face the for-profit organizations when they are taking the whole distribution channels, or they are taking most part of the economy. And as we know from institutional theory, there is a mimetism that will necessarily reproduce this, no? So that's my question, like how do we do this? And within this question, I have my own questions, which are what do we have to create on the one hand, and on the other hand, what do we have to take? Because I feel that in degrowth and in post-growth, there is always the things that we have to create from scratch all the time. But most part of the supply chains and the economy is already working. So I guess that there are some things to take away, like distribution channels. So what is your opinion on this? Thank you. I'm sorry for all these technical issues.
No, it's good. I did miss the middle question, but we can start talking about the first two and then maybe come back to it. So you talked about like the limits of managing surplus in not-for-profits. And I think that's the really interesting question, because it also comes back to this discussion of what's the role of the state and what's the role of like decentralized planning. I love that term. And I think that, then we can talk about if a not-for-profit business gets way too much surplus. So it could also just go into a policy where we start radically taxing, surplus over a certain amount, or, we can use existing policy mechanisms that we are supposed to be effective for redistributing profit in the for-profit economy, but those could actually be effective in the not-for-profit economy. So if a company gets way more surplus than it should or needs, then we can, tax that, and it could be a municipality tax even, so it stays local, and the local community can use it the way that it wants to, hopefully with some participatory budgeting in there as well. So I think that's one of the ways to deal with it. Okay, then you asked how something, and I missed it because the sound wasn't very clear, I think, coming through the phone. But we can come back to that maybe, because your next question built on that, which is, what do we have to create and what do we have to take? Because you talked about degrowth often frames things almost like we have to make things from scratch. And I totally agree with you that there's already a lot working out there. And that's one of the things that drew me to this line of work is it's based on existing frameworks. It's based on existing businesses, and so we don't have to create anything from scratch. It's just about identifying what's already working well, and then identifying how we can support that to make a fully functional post-growth economy. So I think, and actually, funnily enough, Ben and I have been talking about this, like what are the organizing principles that can help us delineate or more clearly discuss what should be included and excluded from post-growth and degrowth. So one of the things we've been talking about is like, yeah, it's got to be non-accumulative. It's got to be not-for-profit. It's got to have a vision for changing the entire system. And so these are some of the ways we can think about what to include and what to exclude from post-growth. And then, I think that we probably already have enough to start with, and we don't have to create much from scratch at all. We just have to identify the things that are post-growth compatible and identify ways of supporting them so that we can have that transition. That's my opinion. But then you asked this middle question. I didn't want to cut you off because we're having such a difficult time communicating anyways. But if you want to try again, we can try again. Otherwise, you can send it to me by email.
Okay, he can't say anything now because I just hung up the phone, but we can continue this conversation some other time or be in touch. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Well, also, thank you again. What a nice note to end this. It's just the beginning, right? It's just the start. Let's all stay in touch. I mean, if you want anyone to talk to people in Sweden, I reckon Mario or anyone of our group will be super happy as well. And a lot of connections to be made. Yeah, and watch this space. There will be a book chapter on this, hopefully.
Yes, exactly.
So can't thank you enough. But
thank you too. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you to everybody for your great comments and questions and insights, because I've gotten a lot from this. So
perfect. So yes, I think there is no more questions. Mario says hi via WhatsApp, so he's still there. But perfect. Yeah, let's all keep in touch, and do you want to put your email in the chat because Javi is already asking, or should I just share it in the group?
Yeah, you can just share it in the group. Yeah.
Okay, I will share it with people. And thank you so much again. And everybody, enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you all for coming, particularly also the people from Retrace. Fantastic that you could join us as well and make this such a well-attended seminar.
Great, thanks so much.